In late December of 1908, somewhere south of 69 degrees latitude, the French expedition ship Pourquoi Pas stopped moving. It stayed stopped for 11 consecutive days. The position log recorded the same coordinates, entry after entry, across nearly 2 weeks of an active survey voyage that had been averaging 60 to 90 nautical miles per day. The official explanation was weather, pack ice, conditions that made the ship immovable. What the official explanation does not account for is what Expedition Commander Jean-Baptiste Charcot wrote in a private letter 3 weeks later to a colleague in Paris about what he found during those 11 days. The record of that finding begins, and then it stops. Jean-Baptiste Charcot was not an amateur. He was the son of Jean-Martin Charcot, the neurologist who trained Sigmund Freud. He studied medicine in Paris, captained his own vessels from the age of 31, and by 1903 had already led one full Antarctic expedition aboard the Français. That first voyage is well documented. It produced geographical charts, biological catalogues, and Charcot Island, which still carries his name on modern maps. He returned to France as a decorated scientist. The government funded a second, larger expedition. He commissioned a new vessel called the Pourquoi Pas, which translates to Why Not. He departed in August of 1908. This is where the official record becomes selective. Hold that word. We will return to it. The Pourquoi Pas reached the Antarctic Peninsula in late November of 1908. The crew conducted surveys along the western coastline, documented new island formations, and collected sediment samples at multiple sites. All of this appears in the published expedition record. It is confirmed and logged. But then, in late December, the position log changes character. The coordinates stop advancing. The same location appears across 11 consecutive daily entries. The official account describes this as an involuntary pause due to ice conditions. That explanation accounts for the stillness of the ship. What it does not account for is the secondary record. Charcot maintained 2 sets of notes during the voyage. This is documented and not disputed. The first was the official expedition journal submitted to the French Geographical Society upon return. The second was a personal journal, referenced in correspondence with his wife Meg Clerk, in letters dated from Punta Arenas in January of 1909. The personal journal has never been found. This is not unusual in itself. Personal journals from expeditions of this era are frequently lost, destroyed, or absorbed into private family estates. The standard explanation is entropy. Paper deteriorates. Estates dissolve. What makes this case different is a single letter. In a letter, Charcot wrote to a colleague, the oceanographer Jules de Guern, whose papers are held at the Muséum National of Natural History in Paris. Charcot uses a phrase that has not received scholarly attention proportional to its weight. He writes, in translation, "The formation we encountered at the southern deviation has no analogue in the existing literature." He does not describe the formation further. He redirects to logistical matters. He asks de Guern to arrange storage space for certain specimens that he describes only as requiring particular conditions. Those specimens are not listed in the expedition's published catalogue. But that phrase is not the anomaly. This is. 3 weeks after that letter was written, Charcot gave an address to the French Geographical Society. The address has been transcribed and is publicly available. In it, he describes the expedition's major findings across 12 printed pages. The word formation does not appear once in those 12 pages. Neither does southern deviation. An expedition commander who spent 11 stationary days in late December of 1908, who described an unprecedented feature in private correspondence, then submitted a formal account that references neither the feature nor the location where he found it. That gap requires an explanation. The official record does not provide one. To understand what Charcot may have encountered, you need to understand what was being systematically revised in the cartographic record of that period. So Yulingdemwu Dayu. Between roughly 1700 and 1900, the maps of the world underwent a sustained process of relabeling. Lands that had previously been designated under the name Tartary, a vast category covering territories from Eastern Europe through Central Asia and deep into Siberia, were gradually subdivided and absorbed into the administrative categories of the empires replacing them. This is not a fringe argument. The term Tartary appears in the 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, which describes it as occupying more land area than any other designation on Earth. By 1900, the word had been largely retired from official cartography. There is a simpler question underneath this one. Why does the removal of a geographic designation matter to an Antarctic expedition in 1908? Because the question of what occupied Antarctica before the modern era of exploration is directly connected to the question of what the pre-modern world actually looked like. The Peary-Rees map of 1513 depicts a southern landmass with coastal features that were not officially charted until the late 20th century. The Orontius-Phineas map of 1531 shows Antarctica with rivers and mountain ranges. These documents are held in established institutions. They are not fabrications. The standard explanation is that these cartographers worked from older source maps, now lost, and made fortunate guesses, or that the landmass depicted coincidentally resembles something else entirely. That explanation requires you to accept a considerable accumulation of coincidences. What it does not require, but what becomes harder to set aside the longer you look, is the possibility that the world before the 19th century contained structures, settlements, and knowledge systems that the official historical framework has not fully incorporated. Charcot operated at the exact moment when that framework was being finalized. He was a scientist, but he was also a man who understood how institutions worked. His father had spent a career navigating the political architecture of French academic medicine. Jean-Baptiste understood, in a way that was probably instinctive by then, what could be submitted and what could not. A man who found a curious rock formation does not write that. A man who found something that did not fit the story being written around him does. And then the record stops. This is the detail that has received the least attention in the existing literature on Charcot's second expedition. The 11 stationary days in the official log fall between December 21st and December 31st of 1908. The recorded position places the Pourquoi Pas at approximately 69 degrees south, 76 degrees west, within the area now partially designated as Wilkes Land on the Pacific-facing side of the continent, though the precise territorial designation shifts depending on which national claims you apply. That position, held for 11 consecutive days, places the vessel at the outer edge of what modern surveys have identified as one of the more anomalous subglacial regions on the continent. Beneath the ice at that general location, radar surveys conducted in the late 20th century detected large-scale structural anomalies that do not match the expected profile of natural geological formation. The most cited of these features is a roughly circular mass concentration, approximately 300 kilometers across, buried under more than a mile of ice. Its origin remains disputed. Some researchers attribute it to a meteor impact. Others note that the geometry of the concentration is inconsistent with known impact distribution patterns. Hold that detail and return to Charcot. His ship spent 11 days at coordinates sitting at the outer edge of that region. He wrote privately about a formation with no analogue in the existing literature. He requested storage conditions for specimens not listed in his published catalogue. He then delivered a 12-page official address to the French Geographical Society that mentioned none of it. Consider the geopolitical context of December 1908. This was 3 years before the race to the South Pole. Amundsen would not reach the pole until December of 1911. Scott followed 1 month later and died on the return. The Antarctic continent was, at that moment, one of the last spaces on Earth where the cartographic record was genuinely incomplete. Any discovery made in Antarctica in 1908 existed in a window before the modern institutional framework for Antarctic research had been established. There was no Antarctic Treaty. There was no coordinated international scientific body with jurisdiction over what was found and what was published. There was the French Geographical Society, the expedition's private funder, and the judgment of one man. Charcot chose to close the record. The official explanation treats this as ordinary friction, the incomplete documentation that inevitably accompanies early exploration. What it does not handle is the pattern that emerges when you look at what other expeditions were doing in the same years, because Charcot was not the only one. Between 1895 and 1915, 8 major national expeditions reached the Antarctic continent, representing Britain, Norway, Belgium, Sweden, Germany, Scotland, and France twice over. All 8 produced official reports and published findings that were received as contributions to the growing scientific understanding of the last unmapped territory on Earth. In the private correspondence, the unpublished journals, and the institutional records of at least 4 of these expeditions, there is the same structural signature: explicit references to anomalous findings in private communication with no corresponding entry in the official reports, along with specimens listed as collected but absent from published catalogues, and stationary periods in position logs that official accounts attribute to weather. The German Gauss expedition of 1901 to 1903, led by Erich von Drygalski, spent 35 days frozen in pack ice near 66 degrees south before being freed by the volcanic ash technique that Drygalski himself developed. The official account describes this as an involuntary delay. Drygalski's private letters, portions of which appeared in a 1989 German academic review published posthumously, describe a period of observation during that stationary phase that he calls, in translation, inconsistent with the geological character of the region. He does not elaborate further in the surviving letters. The Scottish National Antarctic Expedition of 1902 to 1904, led by William Spares Bruce, returned with meteorological data and ocean depth soundings that contradicted the expected bathymetric profile of the Weddell Sea. Bruce submitted his findings. A portion of the depth sounding data was subsequently reclassified by the British Admiralty, which had co-funded the expedition. The reclassification was noted in Bruce's own correspondence as occurring without his consent. The official explanation for each of these gaps, taken individually, is plausible, attributing each silence to weather, incomplete records, or the ordinary friction between scientists and their funders. Taken together, they describe something more specific: 4 separate expeditions from 4 separate nations with different commanders, different funders, and different scientific objectives, produced a remarkably consistent pattern of selective disclosure across a single 15-year window. The question worth sitting with is not whether this was coordinated. The question is, what 4 men, working independently and thousands of miles apart, all separately, decided not to say? Institutional suppression does not require conspiracy. That distinction matters, because the moment you invoke coordination, you invite dismissal. What it requires is incentive alignment. In 1908, the institutions that received, evaluated, and published expedition findings had a shared interest in a coherent historical narrative. The geographical societies of Europe were not merely academic bodies. They were connected to the colonial and imperial apparatus that depended on the idea that the world's geography was being discovered in a linear, progressive sequence from ignorance toward knowledge. A finding that suggested prior occupation of Antarctica, or a structural formation inconsistent with known geological history, created a scientific problem and a political one simultaneously. If Antarctica contained evidence of prior habitation, or of infrastructure predating the current historical model, the implications extended far beyond the continent. They reached back into every territory that had been surveyed, mapped, and claimed during the preceding 4 centuries. A single expedition commander, returning from the southern ice with a formation that had no analogue in the existing literature, faced a calculation that did not require anyone to instruct him. He could submit the finding and trust the institution to evaluate it fairly. He could wait for the consequences of what fair evaluation might produce. Or he could write a careful letter to one colleague, request private storage for certain specimens, and deliver a 12-page address to the French Geographical Society describing the expedition's considerable scientific achievements. Charcot was a careful man. He came from a family that understood institutions. He chose the 12-page address. What he chose not to say tells us more than what he said, and the record he left behind is exactly detailed enough to show where it was closed. The personal journal of Jean-Baptiste Charcot has not been located. The specimens described as requiring particular conditions are not listed in the catalogue held by the Museum National of Natural History. The Wilkes Land subglacial anomaly remains officially unresolved. These are not interpretations, they are the state of the record. What the record cannot tell us is whether the formation Charcot described and the subglacial anomaly at Wilkes Land occupy the same ground. It cannot tell us what the specimens contained or where they went. It cannot tell us why 4 separate expeditions across 4 separate nations produced the same pattern of selective disclosure within a 15-year window. What it can tell us is that the official history of Antarctic exploration was written by men who knew more than they published, and that the gaps in that history follow a shape. The record closes. The question does not. The next video examines the 1912 Amundsen expedition log. His team spent 4 days at a site the official record describes as a navigational waypoint, and not a single sample was logged from that location across those 4 days.